All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, I'm stepping in as your expert historian to help you absolutely unmask ancient Greece's greatest PR campaign. My goal here is to arm you with the ultimate A-level review guide because, the Sparta we all think we know, that unbreakable, ultra-disciplined warrior society from the movies, well, it's actually largely an illusion. So today, we are going to tear down that illusion using the actual ancient sources, and I'm going to show you exactly how to structure your arguments to completely ace your exam. Here is our roadmap to mastering this complex historiography. We'll be defining the Spartan Mirage, seeing how the invincibility myth was built, finding the cracks in that mirage, going over the source utility framework, and finally, mastering your exam essay. Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, defining the Spartan Mirage. To really grasp this illusion, we first need to define the term lakinismos. This word reveals just how obsessed other Greeks were with the Spartan ideal. It's actually a term coined by modern scholars based on ancient attitudes, and it captures the fundamental problem for us historians. Think about it. Almost everything we know about Sparta was actually written by non-Spartans. You had these Athenian intellectuals who were frankly pretty exhausted by their own chaotic democracy, looking down south and heavily romanticizing Sparta as this flawless, unchanging utopia. The Mirage is entirely built on this external, highly idealized lens. Now, a central pillar of this idealized image rests on another key term: eunomia. This was the widespread belief that Sparta possessed flawless, unchanging, good order and harmony. And honestly, that's exactly what other Greeks desperately wanted to believe. Ancient writers attributed this perfect system to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus. Even Thucydides claimed they had the exact same constitution for over 400 years. This supposed domestic harmony and total equality among citizens created a seriously attractive model for any outsider looking for a bit of political stability. But actually, scratch that utopian vision for a second, because behind that pristine curtain of good order lay a pretty terrifying hidden reality called oliganthropia. This was a critical manpower crisis that threatened their very survival. While Sparta was busy projecting an image of endless, invincible warriors, the truth was that their incredibly strict citizenship rules and constant warfare were drastically draining their population. The Mirage of eunomia actively worked to hide the reality of oliganthropia from the rest of the Greek world. It's like a giant cover-up. Moving on to Section 2, building the invincibility myth. So we've all heard the epic tales of the 300 Spartans at the Hot Gates, right? Well, this famous epitaph from 480 BC basically became the foundation of the myth. It projected to the world that Spartans would absolutely rather die than disobey orders or retreat. Yes, Thermopylae was a genuine military achievement, but the cultural fallout was just massive. This simple two-line inscription recorded by Herodotus established two absolute pillars of the Spartan reputation: total obedience to the state and a total refusal to surrender. Notice the phrasing of the epitaph itself: "We followed orders." It implies an almost robotic, flawless discipline. And this brilliantly illustrates scholar J.T. Hooker's argument. Sparta didn't just sit back, they actively weaponized this reputation, using internal propaganda and absolute secrecy. It wasn't just outsiders making things up, the Spartans were totally complicit. First, they spread these legendary tales. For example, when Brasidas' mother boldly claimed Sparta had many better men than her dead, heroic son, what a perfect cover for their manpower crisis, right? Then, they strictly enforced Thucydides' famous secrecy of their political arrangements, basically preventing anyone from actually counting their troops. Finally, they circulated epothegmata, those famously brief, witty, laconic sayings that made them sound completely untouchable. All right, let's look at Section 3, cracks in the Mirage. 120. That is the exact number of elite Spartiates who absolutely shocked the Greek world by surrendering at the Battle of Sphacteria in 425 BC. Trapped on an island by the Athenians, cut off from food, these men didn't fight to the death. No, they laid down their weapons. For the Greek world, which had spent half a century completely intoxicated by the myth of Thermopylae, this event was literally earth-shattering. There is such a jarring contrast here between the fierce death-before-surrender myth and the stark historical reality of Sphacteria. Plutarch famously recorded the Spartan mother's demand to come back with your shield or on it. Yet Thucydides writes that the surrender at Sphacteria was the most extraordinary thing to have happened in the war. Why? Because outsiders genuinely believed Spartans would rather starve than surrender. The Mirage was so incredibly potent that when it finally cracked, the psychological shock was felt across the entire Mediterranean. Which brings us to Section 4, the Source Utility Framework. Let me tell you a secret. Examiners absolutely love it when you deploy a framework like this in your essays. You really need to cross-examine these ancient writers. Contrast Thucydides' deliberate skepticism against Plutarch's massive 500-year delay and his obvious moralizing agenda. Herodotus is fantastic for showing us how the Greeks perceived Sparta at the time of Thermopylae, but let's be real, he often falls hook, line, and sinker for Spartan propaganda. Thucydides is brilliant because he actively points out Spartan secrecy and calls out the Mirage at Sphacteria. But remember, he is an Athenian general. And Plutarch, he's your go-to source for all those cool, laconic sayings, but he's writing half a millennium later, using Sparta as a moral model for his Roman readers. You absolutely must evaluate these biases in your writing. Finally, Section 5, Mastering Your Exam Essay. I really want you to ask yourself this one absolutely crucial question. Was this famous illusion actually just a mirror reflecting the anxieties and desires of other Greek city-states? Because this is the ultimate analytical angle for your exam. The Mirage wasn't just some lie Sparta told. It was a fantasy that Athens and others desperately needed to believe in. They needed a model of perfect stability to contrast with their own messy, chaotic politics. So the key takeaway here is that a top-tier A-star essay always acknowledges that the Mirage exaggerated a real kernel of truth. It was just amplified by strict Spartan secrecy and the ideological needs of outside observers. When you're writing your conclusion, run through this checklist. First off, don't say the Mirage was 100% fake. The Agage was real. Their military was genuinely elite. Second, deploy Thucydides Chapter 5, Section 68. Point out that the secrecy of their political arrangements made fact-checking basically impossible. Third, acknowledge the much later romanticization by writers like Plutarch. And finally, show your examiner that Spartans weren't just passive victims of this myth. They actively weaponized this external idealization to hide their shrinking population. So it wasn't entirely a lie, right? It was more like an exaggerated reflection. When you sit down to write your exam, how will you separate the myth from the men? The Spartan Mirage is perhaps history's most successful public relations campaign because it relied equally on the silence of its subjects and the really loud imagination of its neighbors. Critically assess your ancient sources, apply this framework, and you will absolutely dominate this topic. Good luck on your exams and keep questioning the history you've been handed.